What if the most exhausted person you know is actually sitting on the most extraordinary transformation you've ever witnessed? Stay with me. Because what Carl Jung discovered about the psychology of giving and what happens when it finally stops will completely reframe everything you thought you knew about empaths. Most people look at someone who gives endlessly and see weakness. They see someone who can't say no, someone who absorbs pain like a sponge and keeps coming back for more. But Jung saw something entirely different. He saw someone in the early stages of the most radical psychological metamorphosis a human being can undergo. Here's what nobody tells you about empaths who overgive. And by the end of this, you'll never look at a quietly exhausted person the same way again. Carl Jung understood that the human psyche isn't static. It moves, it builds pressure. And when that pressure reaches a certain threshold, something irreversible happens. Jung called it enantiodromia, the moment when something pushed to its extreme turns into its opposite. And nowhere is this more dramatic, more complete, than in the empath who has spent years pouring from an empty cup. You see, overgiving isn't random. According to Jung's theory of psychological types, empaths operate primarily through what he called the feeling function, a sophisticated internal system for reading emotional environments, anticipating the needs of others, and orienting the self around relational harmony. For years, sometimes decades, this function runs in one direction only: outward, always outward. They give comfort they never received. They hold space that was never held for them. They absorb tension so that others can breathe. And the world, especially those who have learned to take, calls this love. But Jung knew better. He called it the unlived life, the self that keeps getting postponed. Here's where it gets fascinating and a little terrifying. According to Jung, the psyche has its own intelligence, its own immune system, and when the conscious mind keeps sacrificing the self on the altar of other people's needs, the unconscious begins to collect a debt. Silently, patiently, with absolute precision, every dismissed need gets recorded, every swallowed boundary, every moment the empath said "I'm fine" when they were breaking. Jung called this accumulation the shadow, not darkness in the moral sense, but unlived energy, suppressed power. The parts of the self that never got permission to exist. And here's the part that changes everything. The shadow doesn't disappear, it grows. Most people assume that years of emotional overgiving simply break a person, that they burn out, shut down, and become hollow versions of themselves. And yes, there is a burnout phase. Jung acknowledged this crucible. He called it the night sea journey, a descent into psychological darkness that feels like dissolution. But what Jung discovered is that this dissolution isn't the end. It's the beginning of something the world is rarely prepared for. Because inside that exhaustion, buried underneath all those years of postponed needs and silenced truths, is something that has been quietly becoming. Something forged not in comfort, but in the specific fire of feeling everything and receiving almost nothing. Jung called it the individuated self, and once it emerges, nothing is ever the same. Here's what that emergence actually looks like. Pay close attention, because this is the part people always miss. The empath who has overgiven for years doesn't suddenly become cold. They don't become bitter, calculating, or closed. Jung understood that true individuation doesn't harden the heart, it clarifies it. What changes isn't their capacity to feel. What changes is their relationship with that capacity. They stop treating their empathy as an obligation and start treating it as a resource. They stop giving to fill the silence and start giving only where it's genuinely received. They stop mistaking someone's need for their responsibility. Jung called this the transcendent function, the ability to hold both tenderness and boundaries simultaneously. To be warm without being consumed, present without being absorbed. This isn't something most people ever develop, but the empath who has been emptied enough times, they develop it by necessity. And what's born from necessity in the psyche, Jung discovered, is almost always permanent. But here's what will genuinely shift something in you. According to Jung's concept of psychological projection, people who take from empaths aren't actually seeing them. They're seeing what they need them to be: a mirror, a container, an audience. And for years, the empath unconsciously cooperates with this projection, shrinking themselves to fit the shape others require. The transformation happens the day they stop cooperating. Not with anger, not with confrontation, with something far more unsettling to those who relied on their compliance: with clarity. Jung observed that the most destabilizing thing an individuated person can do is simply become impossible to project onto. When the empath stops performing their old role, when they no longer chase, absorb, apologize, and explain, the entire dynamic collapses. Because it was never built on connection. It was built on their willingness to disappear, and they are done disappearing. What comes next is what Jung called the return to the self, and it's nothing short of magnificent. The empath who has survived years of emotional overgiving doesn't just recover. They arrive, perhaps for the first time, at a version of themselves that is entirely their own. Not shaped by who needed them, not defined by who they lost, not diminished by who failed to see them. They become selectively generous, radically honest, quietly unshakable. They still feel everything. But now that feeling has direction. It serves them first and extends to others from a place of genuine abundance rather than compulsive emptiness. Jung said the most powerful psychological position any individual can occupy is one of conscious wholeness, knowing your light, knowing your shadow, and choosing deliberately how you show up. The transformed empath doesn't just reach this position. They earn it in a way that leaves no doubt every layer of it was paid for. And this is Jung's final, most important insight about what empaths become. He said that those who have been forced by circumstance to descend into themselves, to face what they suppressed, reclaim what they abandoned, and integrate what they feared, emerge with something that cannot be taught in any classroom and cannot be faked in any relationship. Earned wisdom, the kind that recognizes manipulation before it speaks, that senses inauthenticity in a smile, that knows the difference between someone reaching for connection and someone reaching for supply. They are no longer available to be consumed, and that, more than any show of strength, is what makes them extraordinary. Carl Jung spent a lifetime studying the architecture of the human psyche, and what he found consistently at the end of every genuine transformation was this: the people who give the most are not the weakest in the room. They are the ones most capable of becoming whole. And once they do, the world doesn't quite know what to do with them, because they finally know exactly what to do with themselves.